Crocodilians are one of the most recognizable animals on our planet. From alligators to salties and even odd creatures like the gharial, there are so many of these amazing animals. This is one of the most successful families of animals to have ever lived, with their most ancient ancestors appearing in the clade known as Pseudosuchia. The Pseudosuchia first appeared in the Olenekian, the earliest part of the Triassic, about 250 million years ago. Many of these early forms dominated most of the Triassic before dinosaurs began to take over in the Jurassic. Pseudosuchia, and subsequently crocs as a whole, are part of the group known as Archosaurs. Archosauria is an ancient lineage of reptiles, splitting off from other reptiles even prior to the Triassic. They are so ancient that much of their origins are still shrouded in mystery. While a majority of the Archosaurs would form the group known as Ava Metatarsilia, which included the dinosaurs, birds, and pterosaurs, the Pseudosuchians began to diverge and evolve all on their own, creating many unique groups along their journey. It is important to note that the exact origins of this group is still poorly understood overall. One major reason for that is the fossils. We have many Triassic examples of Pseudosuchians, but many of their origins seems to point towards an evolution before or very early in the Triassic. Many different groups of them had already begun to take shape, representing multiple clades by the time the earliest members begin to appear in the fossil record. This has caused numerous debates about the exact history of these animals and debates over the exact placement of their lineage. With that in mind, there may be mistakes across this video, as these animals' relationships are still not fully understood, and many studies contradict one another. A lot of information will be subject to change as we learn more about these animals. Many people will say crocodilians haven't changed in millions of years, and they're kind of right, but they have a massive history of change to lead to the swamp puppies we know today. One group, known as the phytosaurs, has had some debate about it over the years. They have long been considered the most basal Pseudosuchians and some of the earliest examples of the group overall. However, at one point this was contested because some scientists believe that phytosaurs were in fact the sister group to Archosaurs and weren't Pseudosuchians at all. A 2011 study argued that they had evolved alongside the other Archosaurs, and they believed that that could distinguish them from other crocs as a whole based on 10 distinct traits found in Archosaurs that were not found in phytosaurs. However, another study in 2016 reanalyzed the original findings and revealed that several of these traits were lacking variably through many Archosaur taxa, including other Pseudosuchians, and some were in fact present on some phytosaurs. Thus, it was updated once again, showing us that phytosaurs do in fact fall into Pseudosuchians, though as the most basal forms, rearranging much of the family as a whole. Phytosaurs take on many forms, with 3 distinct body plans. Most phytosaurs have rather large heads, which can also distinguish them from other Pseudosuchians, but they can still be classified in 3 ways. The first of these are known as the dolichorostral, which are the long-snouted forms. These animals would have occupied a mainly piscivorous niche, using their long jaws to help them snap up prey. The dolichorostral phytosaurs are homodonts, meaning they only have a single type of tooth, which are conical, just like modern crocodilians. These cone-shaped teeth would be perfect for snatching up aquatic prey. Examples of these animals are animals like Rudiodon, which is found in relative abundance in the eastern United States. As opposed to them, you have the brachyrostral phytosaurs. These animals, instead of long and thin snouts, had literally the exact opposites. Their snouts were much shorter, but far broader, like modern alligatorids. Instead of fish, they occupied the opposite niche, being more in favor of hunting prey close to the water's edge, a traditional crocodilian approach. These animals could tackle far larger prey, and because of that, many of them are larger than the other phytosaurs. One example of this, Sphenosuchus, was estimated to be anywhere from 23 to 40 feet in length, or about 7 to 12 meters. Even using a more median number, that still makes them one of the largest predators of that time. As opposed to the homodont teeth, these predators had heterodont teeth, meaning they had multiple types. Their front teeth were tusk-like, meant to impale and hold on to prey. Their rear teeth were more blade-like and would have been used to slice and tear carcasses apart. Very active and efficient predators. The third and final type of phytosaur are known as altirostral phytosaurs, and they fall somewhere in between. These animals had broader snouts than animals like Rudiodon, but longer and weaker snouts than animals like Sphenosuchus. These includes animals like Redondosaurus, which had a relatively long head with a broad rear skull, similar to modern crocodilians. Thus, they fall in between and were sort of a generalist feeder, like many crocs today. But these phytosaurs have some pretty big distinctions from the crocs we know and love today. Phytosaurs are a confusing group to some folks, as they look almost identical to modern crocs when you see some of their images, but they have several features that set them apart. First and foremost, their armor. Indeed, they do have osteoderm armor like modern crocodilians, but they were overall much more heavily armored. Their scutes are heavier than most and provide excellent protection. On top of that, they have something known as gastralia, which are known as abdominal ribs. Much like a Tyrannosaurus, these gastralia would provide better structure to the animal, as well as providing additional protection to their underside. Their ankles are also far more primitive than modern crocs, giving them a limited range of motion, but they have one clever adaptation that I think is excellent. Their nose, instead of being located on their snout, is located on the top of their head, usually above the eyes. This would allow them to submerge all but the top of their head, which may have been necessary for them as they may not have been adapted to holding their breath like crocs today. Modern crocs use a bony palate in the back of their mouth to allow them to open their jaws underwater without intaking said water. While it is assumed that many extinct crocodilomorphs used a fleshy or bony palate, we cannot be certain this extended all the way back to phytosaurs. This would have made them worse at holding their breath, in stark contrast to modern variations. But phytosaurs are a mysterious group, and even today their origins are murky and cloudy at best. Many species we have discovered were all well adapted to their aquatic lifestyle already, and a few of the earliest forms have been found, but that leaves large gaps in the history of these animals. Phytosaurs, however, could just not adapt fast enough to the changes. Though they are abundant during the Triassic, it seems that they may have perished completely before the end of it, though there have been rumored phytosaur fossils in the early Jurassic sediment as well. But other basal Pseudosuchians were here as well. A relatively poorly known group, the Ornithosuchids, were also present, and while we do have a relatively good idea about their general body plan, only a few taxons have been discovered. These animals have an interesting skull, with the front having a gap between the teeth known as a diastema. This gap was purposeful, and they had two larger lower teeth that would fit into this gap from the bottom jaw. They were similar to some of their other relatives in that they were land-based animals as well, usually moving around on 4 legs. However, they had the ability to move on 2. These are known as facultative bipeds, and they are like chimpanzees, able to walk on just 2 legs for a short period of time. Despite the lack of fossil material, the material we do have is known from several different countries, being Brazil, the UK, and Argentina, which suggests that they were relatively successful animals and were widespread. One of the most notable and complete of these animals is Rauisuchids from Argentina. It would have been a predator, around 6.5 feet or 2 meters in length. The Ornithosuchids would have been land-based, and hopefully more fossil material is revealed to help us learn more about them. But phytosaurs and Ornithosuchids weren't the only group to dominate during the Triassic. The Triassic was a true age of reptiles, and they diversified heavily during this time as well. Separate from the phytosaurs and Ornithosuchids, a new group of animals known as the Suchia had begun to diversify. These were more derived than the phytosaurs, and they split into multiple different groups. In the late Triassic, one of the most prominent among these were the Aetosaurs. This group takes almost everything you think you know about crocs and turns it on its head. Instead of a mainly aquatic lifestyle, many of these animals were strictly terrestrial. They were almost like the crocodile equivalent of Ankylosaurids. They were pretty large and heavily armored. Their osteoderms were thick, interlocking plates, and many were even armored on their undersides, with one major exception, which was an animal called Damascosuchus. This was an adaptation for predators, of course. Also, instead of being predators themselves, many Aetosaurs were omnivores or herbivores. Their teeth have shown this, being very similar to other animal groups who have ventured away from reliance on meat. Many Aetosaurs have a very pig-like, shovel-shaped snout. They also have adaptations that would enable them to dig more effectively, like large claws. This would allow them to find food among the roots and dirt, another indicator that they were herbivores. Though it is worth noting, some teeth are much more like those of carnivores, and may imply that some Aetosaurs were omnivores, or perhaps they were carnivores, though the latter is far less likely based on the rest of their body plan. They were incredibly diverse animals, and today more than 20 different taxons are known. Unfortunately, like many of the other Suchians, they're a bit shrouded in mystery when it comes to their origins. Like the phytosaurs, the Aetosaurs we have found are overall highly adapted and specialized animals, already fairly well along in their evolution. We aren't positive how they came about, nor what most of their ancestors would have been like. What we do know about Aetosaurs is that there were multiple types. Some early examples, such as Aetostauroides, doesn't fall into a specific group and is instead separated from the rest. They were relatively simple animals, sharing the overall body plan of their family. From here, a group of Aetosaurs known as the Staganolepididae split into 2 distinct groups, the Aetosaurines and the Damascosuchids. The Damascosuchids were defined by having less complex armor overall, but more generalized animals. They more commonly had large spines and spikes, as well as grooved osteoderms, and many of them also had the shovel-like nose I mentioned earlier. The Aetosaurines were classified by having lighter skulls overall, with many of the major differences lying in their skull shape. Many of them often also had more specialized armor, femur, although it was often less spiky and protruding as the Domastasuchia. Aetosaurs were one of the dominant life forms during their time in the late Triassic, but they shared their success with many of their relatives. Much like the dinosaurs later on, these primitive archosaurs were battling for survival and dominance, and the Pseudosuchia tried many different routes at this time with varying levels of success. And the Aetosaurs just so happened to be one of their most successful gambles, for a time. Separate from the Aetosaurs, but still not among the later groups, two taxons stand out. This would be Gracilisuchids and Sphenosuchids. Gracilisuchids has actually been the subject of quite the debate from its discovery up until now. When it was originally discovered by Alfred Romer, he believed it to be one of the aforementioned Ornithosuchids and the smallest and possibly most basal member of the group. However, in subsequent years, debates arose around its placement, and it was eventually removed from the Ornithosuchids as it was found to have unusual traits in its skull and vertebrae, as well as in its osteoderms that differed it from the Ornithosuchids. This eventually led to further discussion about where it would be placed. Several suggestions were had over the years, and eventually a 2011 study showed that it was closely related to the Aetosaurs and the Rauisuchids, but the debate wasn't over here. In 2014, another study suggested that Sphenosuchids, Gracilisuchids, and another animal known as Goniopholids were all part of a new group known as the Gracilisuchids. Their placement was the same, closely related to the Aetosaurs, but now as a monophyletic group rather than a separate taxon. These Gracilisuchids were tiny animals compared to most of their relatives. Gracilisuchids itself is estimated to be no more than 11 inches or 28 centimeters in length. They had 2 rows of osteoderms running down their back, and they were once considered to be faculative bipeds like the Ornithosuchids, but more recent interpretations seem to have them restrained to all 4 limbs. This family is, once again, poorly known outside of these 3 taxons, but they're still brilliant. From here, another line of the Suchia would be created, which would survive the Triassic, the Crocodilomorpha. But these guys are still confusing, especially to many who have a hard time keeping track, so I'll do my best to help you guys get a better understanding of their arrangement and what would eventually lead to modern crocs as we know them. Some of the most basal of these animals are the Poposauroidea. They were advanced on terms of early archosaurs and were what most of you probably imagine when thinking of Triassic predators, but there is more than meets the eyes with these archosaurs, as some of them are also herbivores. They may have also been the most widespread and successful of the Pseudosuchians at the time, with some taxons like Xylosuchus found in the early Triassic and animals like Ephygia near the end. These animals can be distinguished by a specialized hip and snout structure, which has often gotten them confused for dinosaurs over the years. This is another example of convergent evolution, showing how multiple groups of archosaurs evolved similar adaptations despite having evolved so far apart from one another. Another distinguishing feature about the Poposauroids is their lack of osteoderms, except for one specific animal named Cenozoic. Poposauroids had quite a diversity to them as well, and Cenozoic was one of the most basal of these examples. It is an unusual animal, reaching up to about 3 meters or 10 feet in length. It had extremely small osteoderms lining its body and had a specialized tail that had tall neural spines. This was most likely an adaptation for a semi-aquatic lifestyle, similar to what other marine reptiles would employ in the future. They appeared to have relatively long limbs as well, allowing them to live on land as well as the sea. They are sort of like modern marine iguanas, but predatory. Several other groups began to diversify during this time, including the fairly basal Stenosauricidae. They were some of the other very early archosaurs and were some of the first to get a near global distribution. They were robust quadrupeds, and they also possessed a sail-like structure, which is once again an example of convergent evolution. This sail resembles that of animals like Dimetrodon, Spinosaurus, and Edaphosaurus, with tall neural spines creating it. Examples of these, like the Xylosuchus and Arizonosaurus, were relatively large animals, between 3 to 4 meters or about 10 to 13 feet in length. They were suggested to be rather active hunters due to their large and powerful legs. Xylosuchus is also one of the oldest archosaurs known, having been found in the early Triassic sediment, suggesting it's about 247 million years old. This is kind of what I was talking about earlier, how the origins of these animals are still kind of misunderstood. With Poposauroids appearing so early in the Triassic meant that they had already split off from the rest of the Pseudosuchians, and it means that they had begun this immense diversification even prior to what we have in the fossil record. Most of the animals we've talked about so far, from the phytosaurs to the Aetosaurs, are far younger than Xylosuchus, but still basal and primitive in comparison to the Poposauroids Poposaurioids as a whole. It's absolutely fascinating how much we do know about these animals already, yet how much more is still to be discovered. And it also might mean that the earliest Pseudosuchians may have appeared even before the Triassic, which is absolutely brilliant. Anyways, the next animal we're going to talk about is the namesake for this group, Poposaurus itself, because we can't talk about this group without mentioning the namesake. This was an unusual animal, reaching around 13 to 16 feet or about 4 to 5 meters in length. Their rear legs are placed closer together, like a dinosaur, and are twice as long as their front limbs. This gives them an extremely dinosaur-like appearance and makes them obligate bipeds like many theropod dinosaurs. Again, this is an example of convergent evolution, and these types of shared traits are not too uncommon in these early archosaurs. They likely adopted this stance to become faster, giving them a larger chance to catch their ever-evolving prey sources. The way they are structured has often led people to confuse them for dinosaurs, and I can't say I blame them based on appearance alone. It wasn't until 1977 that they were recognized not as dinosaurs, but as a new type of Pseudosuchian. A few other Poposauroids also stand out, including the unusual Lotosaurus. Like the Sphenosuchids, they had tall neural spines, giving them a sort of sail on their back, so we think. However, they were far more bulky and were in fact herbivores. Lotosaurus had a beak, not unlike the later Ornithosuchian dinosaurs would. They weren't huge, around 1.5 to 2.5 meters, or about 5 to 8 feet, but they were rotund animals and were likely relatively slow-moving herbivores. The last of the Poposauroids that we're going to talk about is a group known as the Ziphosuchids. Once again, these animals heavily resembled early dinosaurs and even have a beak superficially resembling the much later ornithomimids. Like them, they were relatively small, beaked, toothless, and light animals, and were expected to be omnivorous in some way. As you can see, the Poposauroids were an extremely diverse group and experimented with a lot of different body plans during the Triassic. I suppose when you have a lot of time on your hands, you can try a lot of things, and that's certainly what these guys did. That is one reason crocs are so successful today. They have a strategy that has consistently worked for eons, tweaking it ever so slightly to adapt to new environments, and it took a lot of trial and error to achieve their modern body plan. This brings us further down the line of Paracrocodilomorphs to the Loricata, which encompasses all crocodilomorphs and their sister taxon, the Rauisuchids. However, a few taxons don't fall within either family and instead evolved independently within the Loricata, though it does appear that they are closely related to the Rauisuchians. Most of these animals have an upright stance, allowing them a wider range of locomotion. One of these animals, found in Argentina, is Saurosuchus. They were large, quadrupedal predators reaching up to 5.5 meters or 18 feet in length, making them one of the largest of the Rauisuchian lineage. They were extremely dominant predators, though it was revealed in 2023 that they had a relatively weak bite. This was largely on account of the niche they fell into. As the dominant animals of the time, we believe that their teeth had to be just strong enough to tear into a kill that they made to get at the softer meat and organs. They could then leave the rest of the carcass for scavengers after they eat their fill. They were some of the dinosaurs' first bullies, as they shared territory with primitive dinosaurs like Herrerasaurus. Like Saurosuchus, two others, Batrachotomus and Prestosuchus, were also large and heavily built predators. Batrachotomus, like Poposaurus, had shortened front limbs, though not to the same extremes as Poposaurus. This indicates it may have been able to spend some of its time on its hind limbs, however it likely spent most of its life on forelimbs, as it was far more heavily built than Poposaurus. Batrachotomus also has a specialized set of osteoderms running down its spine, giving them an almost spike-like ridge of armor. Prestosuchus, however, was strictly quadrupedal and seemed to be more robustly built overall than Batrachotomus. Both animals were large and heavy predators reaching upwards of 6 meters or 20 feet in length, and Prestosuchus may have reached even larger. They were powerful predators and would have dominated their respective ecosystem, but there was another that was even larger. This is Phytosaurus, one of the last of these Rauisuchian line archosaurs. Estimated to reach up to 10 meters, around 33 feet in length, they were among the largest of their lineage and one of the largest predators in the Triassic. They appeared near the end of the era and is one of the last known of their group before the extinction event. Due to the fragmentary nature of their remains, not much is known outside of it being a powerful and large predator, outsizing many of the large predatory dinosaurs. We do know they have a row of osteoderms as well, similar to Saurosuchus, but not quite as extreme. Now we get into the actual line of true Rauisuchians. I know it's confusing, but while the other aforementioned creatures are technically part of the Rauisuchian line, they are not true Rauisuchians themselves and evolved independently from this group despite sharing a more recent common ancestor. The true Rauisuchids contain some of the most famous members of these early crocodile relatives, including the infamous Prestosuchids. Some of these predators, like the namesake for the group Rauisuchids itself, are restricted to a quadrupedal lifestyle and are more primitive than some of their later relatives. Rauisuchids itself appeared in the early parts of the late Triassic, the Carnian, around 235 million years ago, and soon its family became widespread like many of the other Pseudosuchian archosaurs. With species appearing everywhere from Asia to America, they achieved a near global distribution on land and were some of the most successful predators around. Postosuchus is a more advanced form of Rauisuchian and is a large and powerful predator that we all know and love from the late Triassic. As I mentioned, they're pretty big and they can get upwards of 6 meters, around 20 feet in length, and for the longest time the dinosaurs were in their shadow as they and their family dominated the landscape. Like many members of this group, they were covered in osteoderms as protective armor, most likely to protect from other members of their own species or their relatives, as Pseudosuchians were the dominant predator in almost every environment at the time. Like some of the other creatures previously mentioned, the Poposaurus and Ornithosuchids, these animals had reduced front limbs, allowing them to walk on 2 limbs for a short period of time. Interestingly, this has led to a series of debates that show us while not obligated to walk on 2 limbs, Postosuchus more than likely did most of the time and only supported their weight on front limbs during slower movement and while they were younger, as their rear limbs grew longer as they aged. Despite sharing much of their territory and even many of their traits with other archosaurs, few achieved dominance in the late Triassic like the Rauisuchians. Their large eyes, powerful heads, and fully erect stance made them dangerous and incredibly powerful predators. No herbivore was safe, and even their own relatives would have to fear their strength. But despite all that, these animals did not make it past the Triassic, opening the world to the rule of the dinosaurs. Only one group of Pseudosuchians managed to keep their hold on the world as we transitioned into this new age, and that was the Crocodilomorpha. Before we talk about them, however, let's talk a bit about the Rauisuchids and Poposaurids. Historically, these groups have been debated over their true placement due to the similarities between both of them. Some argue that they should be separated as they currently are, while others believe that they may all represent one large group known as the Rauisuchids. However, the recent diversification of animals classified under the Poposauroids has led to them being split, as differences can be distinguished between the two groups. Because of the initial vagueness in the description of Rauisuchids, some have even considered it a wastebasket taxon, though now it is considered likely to be paraphyletic, meaning a number of different groups that are related to one another but evolved independently. This has led to a whole nother debate as to whether Poposauroids should be included in this at all. Most studies still refer to the Poposaurids as a group having evolved separately from the traditional Rauisuchians, being almost like a sister group to the Loricata. It's a lengthy debate and there is still no clear answer, again due to the lack of ancestral material for many of these groups and how they eventually led to the group we know as Crocodilomorphs. It is thought that these early crocs evolved from a common ancestor that they may have shared with the Rauisuchians. Some of the earliest and most primitive of these early crocodilomorphs are the Sphenosuchians. These are small, lightly built, and show us once again that size and power isn't everything when it came to survival for the crocodilians. Some of these little creatures, like Latargosuchus and Hesperosuchus, were found as far back as the early Triassic, and they've led us to believe that they are ancestral to the crocodiliforms. Many of these little critters were around in the late Triassic as well, and they lasted into the middle of the Jurassic as far as we can tell. As I mentioned, they aren't very large, with most animals like Hesperosuchus reaching around 1.5 meters or 5 feet in length. Despite having evolved a fully terrestrial lifestyle, these animals still tended to stay around water sources, which may have eventually led them back to the water to take advantage of an open niche left by the disappearance of the phytosaurs at the end of the Triassic. They had evolved long and slender limbs, suggesting that they were relatively fast animals, and their small size would have made it easier to survive where others could not. And so, these tiny animals survived into the Jurassic, some of the first of their family to rise after their spectacular fall in the Triassic. Now we're getting into some of the more advanced animals, the crocodiliforms, some of which still appeared around the end of the Triassic. This represented two major groups, the Protosuchia and the Metasuchia. The Protosuchids are also a group that has been up to much debate to the surprise of no one. As our understanding of these animals grew, we understood that their relationships to each other were not so black and white, and many of the animals once considered Protosuchids had to be reclassified in a way. They are not a true clade of animals, but rather represent a group that holds many similarities to one another. This led eventually to an actual new clade, the Meso-Eucrocodilians. This divided the Protosuchians Notosuchians in two, one group within and one group outside of this new clade. Like the Sphenosuchians, they were smaller terrestrial animals, usually no more than a meter long. Many of these animals, like the namesake Protosuchus, were named such because they all resembled true crocodilians despite not actually being them. The Protosuchians were abundant, with those outside of the Crocodilia having been around in the Triassic and the early Jurassic, and those within being around in the late Jurassic into the Cretaceous. Because the relationships between these animals is still poorly understood outside of these age-based groups, it is hard to distinguish and classify them into new clades. However, as our understanding deepens, hopefully we can better configure and understand their relationships to one another. The next group, Metriorhynchids, is just as complicated despite being far better understood. They had further diversified into three major groups, the Notosuchia, Neosuchia, and the Parasauridae. However, more recent studies like the one in 2021 showed that Parasaurids and their line could be classified under Notosuchia, which redefined the groups as a whole, and bringing them down to two major groups, the Notosuchia and the Neosuchia. In the Notosuchia, there are a multitude of diverse taxids, including the aforementioned Parasaurids. Almost all Notosuchians are terrestrial animals with longer legs positioned to allow them to move much more freely along open terrain directly underneath their body. Many of them had specialized eyes and noses because of this, no longer pointing upwards to give them an edge in the aquatic environment. Instead, many of them had lowered nostrils with eyes pointing more forward, giving them a better degree of perception on land, aka binocular vision. The most basal Notosuchians are the Rauisuchids. This group was restrained to areas in Africa and South America, which was once part of a single continent known as Gondwana. Once again, like the two groups preceding, these animals were fairly small and seemed to have a mainly terrestrial lifestyle. Despite not being prominent among crocs today, this was a sound strategy that worked for them for many years, able to lay claim to a niche that today is filled by small mammals, birds, and lizards. One of the most notable members of the Rauisuchids is Rauisuchids, a 6-foot, 1.8 meter long predator. Their osteoderms are rather lightweight and thin, allowing a faster movement, and their eyes are large, even for a croc. There are 6 recognized species of these animals, all falling within the same group. In a popular paper, alongside its relative Anatosuchus and several other crocodiliforms that lived in the same area, one species was nicknamed the rat croc, which is a name I often hear in reference to these guys, and honestly, they don't deserve that, they're adorable. As we travel further down the line of Notosuchians, we come across the Parasauridae and the Mahajungasauridae, and for these guys I thought I'd bring in some backup to talk about them, the DinoGuy. He's been growing recently on both TikTok and YouTube and has rapidly become a great educator in the paleo space. I'll leave links to his stuff down in the description below, but go ahead and take it away, DinoGuy.
The Rauisuchids are closely related to the next group, the Parasauridae, and their sister taxon, the Mahajungasauridae. The Mahajungasaurids only contain 2 species, Mahajungasuchus itself and the very famous Caprisuchus, the boar croc, named for those very impressive interlocking teeth. Traditionally, these animals were considered in the Neosuchian line, but a 2014 and a subsequent 2021 study showed us they were in fact Notosuchians. Caprisuchus itself has traditionally been considered a strictly terrestrial predator, but once again, new information sheds some light on the true nature of these animals. Both animals in this small group actually show adaptation to an aquatic lifestyle, especially Mahajungasuchus. It has been suggested that these two animals both developed aquatic traits, straying away from most of the Notosuchians, who are usually terrestrial animals. Caprisuchus may have been semi-aquatic, ambushing prey from the water, and being able to chase them down if they retreated too far onto land, which of course is a very terrifying concept. These animals were fairly large and capable of tackling large prey, with Caprisuchus reaching up to 20 feet or about 6 meters in length. They were both large, bulky, and heavily built predators with powerful and large teeth made to hold on to their prey. The closest relatives to those fellows are the Pierosaurids, once thought to be an entirely separate clade outside of Notosuchia, but now they are nestled within Notosuchia, though it still contains over 11 species. All of these species have a fairly similar body plan, however. Animals like Montellasuchus show us that these animals were not as large as some of their cousins, staying relatively small at around 2 meters or 6.5 feet long. They were still predators like many of their cousins, and would have preyed upon small animals, including our dinosaur friends. The Notosuchids and many of their relatives existed primarily in the Cretaceous, though some of them have been found in the Jurassic as well, and some have been found to have lived so recently that you'd probably be shocked. Further down the line of Notosuchians brings us to the Ziphosuchia, an incredibly interesting group. Many of the more basal Ziphosuchians are small and possess odd teeth, suggesting they lived a different lifestyle to their counterparts. These include animals like Simosuchus, the little croc relative from Madagascar that recently stole the show in Prehistoric Planet 2. Looking at the teeth, it seems these animals were herbivores rather than carnivores, and stuck with the terrestrial lifestyle. They had adapted so well to it that this particular species had adapted to use underground burrows as a form of shelter. And they weren't the only ones. Another species, Maloasuchus, is also thought to have been a burrowing animal. They truly did try everything. A more advanced group, still closely related to Simosuchus and company, were the Sphenosuchids, which themselves fell under a new classification, the Zenodontosuchia. Many of them had adapted to a mammal-like jaw structure. They were small animals, with the largest reaching about 2 meters or 6.5 feet long, and they were the outliers. Many of these animals didn't exceed much more than 2 feet, about 60 centimeters long. Most of them, however, had odd mammal-like teeth. These include caniform and molariform teeth, which are usually found amongst mammals. This suggested that many of them were omnivores rather than strictly carnivores, and would have allowed them to broaden their spectrum while living with and avoiding the dinosaurs. Now here is where some more complications arise in trying to understand these animals' relationships to one another. Split off from the other Zenodontosuchians was an animal named Rauisuchids. Try to say that 5 times fast. I'm convinced I didn't even say it correctly once. I struggled. They were estimated to reach up to 7 meters long, amongst the largest of all the Notosuchians, and may have occupied a niche similar to theropod dinosaurs, being a land-based predator. But they were old. Current consensus places them in the Bathonian stage of the Jurassic, around 166 million years ago. This means that fairly advanced Notosuchians had evolved before the Cretaceous, when many of their forms could be found. While the species did help bridge the gap, it also opens more questions than it answers. And it doesn't stop there. Rauisuchids is thought to be one of the earliest ancestors to a group known as Sebecids. Unlike many of the other Notosuchians, a majority of these animals are hypercarnivores, though they still kept the Notosuchian tradition of maintaining a terrestrial lifestyle. Many of these animals were also fairly large and powerful creatures, built for big prey, and like dinosaurs, they had a laterally compressed snout, giving them binocular vision. They can be further split into 2 groups, the Barasuchids and the Sebecids. The Barasuchids were found in the Cretaceous, living alongside the dinosaurs and their other relatives. They were large and powerful predators and would have served a sort of middle role in the Cretaceous. They would likely act as both predator and scavenger, taking whatever opportunity came their way. Some, like Barasuchus itself, had bent pterygoid bones, allowing them to have a powerful bite and jaws that could close rapidly, much like modern-day crocodilians. This amount of bite would have allowed them to deal a lot of damage at once when hunting prey. Unlike modern crocs, many Notosuchians had adaptations to allow themselves to remain fully upright for a much longer period of time, as it would have been their primary method of locomotion. This evolution had begun some time ago in many of the Triassic Pseudosuchians, shifting the hips, shoulders, and similar in these animals.
Thanks so much for that, DinoGuy, and because you said something, now I've gotta try it. Rosanna. Yeah, you were right, mate. Wasn't easy. As I said before, he's becoming a great educator, and you should definitely be checking out his stuff. I'll make sure to link it down below. This brings us to an infamous group known as the Sebecids, and their close relatives who don't quite fall into the same category. These would be 2 animals that aren't true Sebecids, being Iberasuchus and Bergisuchus. Unfortunately, both of these animals are poorly known and only represented by fragmentary remains. The remains we do have are mainly skull-based, giving us a fairly clear idea that they were in fact closely related to the Sebecids with a similar compression of the skull. Without more fossil material, however, much of these animals' lifestyles and their exact placement is kind of a mystery. Which brings us to the true Sebecids themselves, one of my personal favorite groups of Notosuchians and one of my favorite groups of Pseudosuchia as a whole. One of the major reasons for my favoritism is that these guys were one of the most recent groups of non-Neosuchians to go extinct. The oldest member known, Ogresuchus, wasn't a very large animal. It reached just over a meter, around 3 feet in length, though it was still a carnivore, thought to have been a predator of infant sauropods. Ogresuchus appeared during the latter stages of the Cretaceous and were among the first of what would become an iconic group. An animal known as Sebecis is the namesake for the group, as it was one of the first members discovered originally in 1937. This animal and its family were named after the Latinized version of the Egyptian god Sobek, who resembles a crocodile. Sebecids could reach up to 3 meters, around 10 feet in length, and their teeth also bear a shocking resemblance to earlier Tyrannosaurids, having a robust yet blade-like design. A major benefit to the Sebecids in their early days was that they no longer lived in the shadow of the dinosaurs, which may have contributed to their rapid success. Sebecids appears in the Paleogene, appearing essentially just after the extinction event, around 60 million years ago. Several of its relatives, like Prestosuchids, would also begin to appear during this time, and they would last until around the middle of the Eocene, around 35 million years ago. Sebecids and its family dominated portions of South America for some time, though they are surprisingly brought up very little compared to others. They were fast, powerful predators who dominated their land-based environment until the mammals began to take over in earnest. One remarkable taxon, Barasuchids, was not only the largest but also the youngest member of the Sebecids. They could reach anywhere from 6 to 7.5 meters, around 20 to 25 feet in length, and weighing in at nearly 2 tons. This makes them larger than any terrestrial mammalian predator of the Cenozoic, and not just them, but any land-based predator since the dinosaurs. Barasuchids first appears during the Eocene, around 40 million years ago, right before Sebecids was becoming extinct. However, they lasted all the way into the Miocene, around 11 million years ago, which makes them an incredibly young member of the Notosuchians. On a geological timescale, that is a fairly recent time period and shows the resilience of these amazing predators, and that the reptiles didn't give up their dominance of the land so easily. Unfortunately, based on what we can tell, they were not around during the Great American Interchange, which occurred around 3 million years ago and allowed the fauna of North and South America to mix cohesively. While they obviously would have changed the American Interchange, it would have been very intriguing to see how the ecosystems balance both the Sebecids and the mammalian carnivores such as saber-toothed cats. But alas, they went extinct about 8 million years too early. And that brings us to the final major clade of the crocodiliforms, the Notosuchia, which encompasses all modern crocodiles and their closest relatives. For these guys, we can trace many of them back all the way to the time of the dinosaurs. One thing, however, is that these animals are actually fairly well understood, which leads to more complications than you might think. Many of these animals share incredibly similar or downright copycat traits to one another, making a true classification hard, and often many studies will contradict one another. While many newer studies have come out in recent years, a lot of them are still kind of debated topics. With that being said, I will try to unravel these animals for you all as best as I can in accordance with those updated studies. The first major group I'd like to discuss is Thalattosuchia, or the marine crocodiles. They are called marine crocodiles, but while they do still fall under the Notosuchia and are closely related to true crocodiles, they are still not the true crocs as we know them. These can be further divided into two groups, the Metriorhynchids and the Teleosauroidea. Within the Teleosauroids were two other groups, the Teleosaurids and the Machimosaurus. These animals had not fully taken to the marine life and still possess many of the traits of their relatives on land. They still possess true legs, and many of them likely would have been able to climb onto land, much like modern seals. They also still possessed osteoderms, though they would take on different forms. The most basal teleosauroid was Plagiophthalmosuchus. Like many of its relatives, aside from having fully adapted to aquatic life, these animals also had incredibly long snouts, likely due to a piscivorous diet. The teleosaurs were relatively large animals, though the teleosaurids were smaller than the Machimosaurids on average. Teleosaurus itself reached around 3 meters long and weighed around 130 pounds, around 60 kilograms. Many teleosaurs are defined by an elongated snout and were likely generalist feeders, with some thought to have sought squid specifically. They heavily resemble modern gharials and some of the ancient phytosaurs as well. It is thought that many of these animals were able to live in coastal areas, and some were even thought to have inhabited freshwater alongside their other relatives. Teleosauroids can be found as far back as the mid-Jurassic, suggesting that they evolved during the age of dinosaurs. They further advanced into two new groups, the Teleosaurine and the Aelodontinae. The Teleosaurine members, like Teleosaurus itself, had developed heavier and sturdier armor, implying that they were more semi-terrestrial and were moving back towards their roots, while the Aelodontinae had reduced and lighter osteoderms and have been found in deeper marine environments. It just shows how diverse even one group could be. The Machimosaurids evolved along a separate line, splitting from the other Teleosaurids during the Jurassic. While they did survive the Jurassic and some forms can be found in the Cretaceous, they never fully recovered and would never achieve the same diversity as they had in the Jurassic. Machimosaurus itself were among the largest of the Teleosaurs, with Machimosaurus reaching just over 7 meters or 23 feet in length. This made them one of the largest crocodiliforms of the Jurassic. They had larger rear feet, likely as an adaptation to allow them better locomotion in the seas. It is thought that Machimosaurids had a more powerful tail and would have been excellent at diving. As opposed to the other Teleosauroids who were more generalistic feeders, Machimosaurs had large and blunt teeth designed for crushing. It's thought that they would have sought out strong-bodied prey like turtles or even arthropods when they were younger. It has also been suggested that they could have tried to feed on land as well, as evidenced by Machimosaurus' teeth found alongside the corpse of a sauropod. However, whether this represents an actual hunt or simply scavenging is unclear at this time. Either way, this sort of niche partitioning is all too common amongst crocodilomorphs and has been a way for them to exist alongside each other for millions of years. Contrary to these semi-generalist animals, the other group of Thalattosuchians was the mainly marine Metriorhynchids. They had several more basal taxons like Thalattosaurs who were less developed, still possessing more feet-like appendages and less specialized tails, though it was apparent they were no longer staying on land. Like the Teleosauroids, they first appear in the Jurassic, but several taxons can also be found in the early parts of the Cretaceous as well. Aside from these outlying animals, the Metriorhynchids could be distinguished by two groups, the Geosaurine and the Metriorhynchini. Of all the archosaurs, few were as well adapted to oceanic life than these two advanced forms of crocodiliform. Instead of the strong and bony osteoderms, they adopted a body plan not unlike other marine reptiles. They lost the armor, instead taking on a more smooth skin type, almost like an ichthyosaur. Their legs had adapted to become more paddle-like, and they developed a tail fluke for better propulsion through the water. Intriguingly, it is also believed that they gave live birth like many other marine reptiles, mammals, and even sharks, as their reduced limbs would have not allowed them on land, and they had a wider and taller hip opening than other Pseudosuchians. Looking at these two groups, one major thing that separates them is their skulls. The Metriorhynchini have more elongated skulls, similar to the Teleosaurs. This suggested that they once again were either more generalized feeders or that they would have more often targeted small fish, squid, and other soft-bodied prey. They were likely extremely fast predators, as their bodies were no longer weighed down by the osteoderms, and their specialized tails would have made it easier for them to chase down the fast and small prey. Most of these animals were not exceptionally large, likely reaching around 3 meters or 10 feet in length. The Geosaurines were another story entirely. Instead of long, thin snouts, they once again had switched it up, having shorter snouts overall, resembling that of mosasaurs. Geosaurus itself had one such skull with large, sharp, and serrated teeth rather than the small pointed teeth of their relatives. One taxon, the Docosaurus, has had its teeth compared to modern killer whales in terms of proportions and suggested they were among the top predators of their time. Geosaurus, like its relatives, only reached around 3 meters in length, but in this case that was not the maximum size for this group. Some animals like Plesiosuchus could reach far larger, nearly 6 meters or more, upwards of 20 feet. This would make them powerful predators in the early Cretaceous and late Jurassic, and allow them to tackle far larger prey. On top of that, because of their lack of osteoderms, they were also incredibly fast and agile swimmers. Because they were focused on larger prey, this allowed them to share territory with the Metriorhynchini, something we call niche partitioning. Seeking two different sources of food reduced competition and would allow them to coexist, which is niche partitioning in a nutshell. That being said, the larger Geosaurines may have hunted the Metriorhynchini if the opportunity arose. Going out of the sea and back to the land brings us to the next group, though this one is one of the most hotly debated groups. In the past, this group was separated into three, being the Elosuchids, the phytosaurs, and the Dyrosaurs. In 1982, it was suggested that a new group was made, the Tethysuchia, as many of these animals shared similarities with one another. However, for many years, Tethysuchia was considered synonymous with the other groups and therefore not used until 2011 when it was revived. However, despite its revival, many studies still haven't used Tethysuchia, and its current status remains in the air. The only one I've noticed is a 2019 study that supported the revival of Tethysuchia and placed the three aforementioned groups within. The exact placement of these groups is still a hotly debated topic. Either way, this group evolved along a separate line and gave us some interesting animals. Most of these animals retain their basic Pseudosuchian body plan and still possess their osteoderms. One of these groups are the Phytosauridae, whose exact members remain somewhat debated. The Elosuchus is thought to be closely related to this group, leading to some of their members to have been classified as Elosuchids in the past. Today, Elosuchidae are now considered to be monophyletic, meaning it only contains a single genus. Phytosaurids heavily resemble modern gharials and first appear during the early stages of the Cretaceous around 145 million years ago. The incredibly popular crocodiliform Sarcosuchus is considered to be a phytosaur. It's no surprise that Sarcosuchus is an incredibly popular animal due to size alone. These massive animals could reach up to 30 feet and reach nearly 5 tons, but Sarcosuchus is an outlier in its own family. Sarcosuchus and the other phytosaurs were thought to be semi-aquatic like modern crocs, and as you can see, they have a relatively long snout, again like modern gharials. Most of this group, like Phytosaurus itself, use this long snout as a fishing tool, just as many others with a similar skull plan. Sarcosuchus, however, was a more generalistic predator, occupying a similar niche to what crocs would become famous for today. You've no doubt seen images over time of these massive crocs attacking and eating dinosaurs, and those images are actually fairly correct. Sarcosuchus in both Africa and South America lived alongside giants in the form of dinosaurs in the early Cretaceous. This massive size allowed them to take advantage of a potentially unique food source, dinosaurs. Interestingly, how they would have processed these giant prey items is still unknown, likely from lateral shakes of its head, because a 2014 biomechanical study showed us that Sarcosuchus was not capable of the crocodile's famous death roll, and therefore would have had to tear pieces off of their prey in a different manner. Despite not being a true crocodile, they are incredibly close on terms of appearance and the behavior we expect to see. Closely related to the phytosaurs and taking on a variety of forms, we have the Dyrosauridae. The earliest known specimens first arose in the Cenomanian, the earliest days of the last stage in the Cretaceous, around 100 million years ago. Thanks to a few key specializations, they achieved a near global distribution during this time, which allowed them to survive the Cretaceous and move into the Paleogene. One major advantage was their tolerance to salt water, similar to the Thalattosuchians. Unlike their cousins, however, they did not fully transition to marine life and rather became much like modern saltwater crocodiles, traversing the coastal marine environments and likely the open ocean on certain occasions. These animals had a variety of traits, and many of them had different shaped snouts. Most commonly, they once again had long and narrower snouts like gharials, likely due to the semi-marine lifestyle. However, they had specialized interlocking teeth which would make it far more difficult for their prey to escape. They do this through what are known as occlusal pits in their jaws. Some of these animals stayed on land, occupying freshwater habitats instead, but a majority of them were seagoers. Studies have shown that they had osteoporotic bones, meaning their bones were spongy and porous like modern cetaceans or turtles. This lightens the load, so to speak, allowing them to be maneuverable animals while still maintaining their protective coating of osteoderms. One of the smaller animals, Goniopholids, was found to live in said freshwater environments during the Paleogene and would have lived alongside the massive Titanoboa. While this may sound like bad news for the croc, recent analysis has shown that Titanoboa may have been a mainly piscivorous animal and may not have tried to tackle relatively large armored prey. One of the larger Dyrosaurids, Phosphatosauros, is an outlier. Once again, it seems to be a trend that the larger animals in these groups become less specialized and more focused on generalistic prey. Such is the case with Phosphatosauros. Estimated to reach up to 9 meters or 30 feet in length, they still had a long and somewhat narrow snout, but it widened towards the rear. As opposed to thin and long teeth, they had much more powerful and blunter teeth, likely used to break through the tough exterior of marine animals like turtles. The drastic difference in the environment, behavior, and appearance of these animals is a testament to their longevity. Moving away from the Phytosaurs and Dyrosaurs, that brings us to our next three groups. While not part of a single unit, these animals all share a more recent common ancestor with one another than they do with any of the other groups. This leads them to be individual families closely related to each other. The first of these are the Poposauridae, small predatory animals. They resemble armored monitor lizards, though they didn't get very large. Some of them, like Poposaurus itself, reached around 17 centimeters, around 6.5 inches. They were around in the late Jurassic and early Cretaceous and likely preyed upon small mammals, early birds, and insects. These little crocs kept their armor, making them a tougher bite to chew than most. Their legs were also relatively long, as they had evolved for terrestrial life. The next group, and the closest related to true crocodiles, were the Goniopholididae. I know, it sounds kinda gross, but I didn't name them. These animals share a very close resemblance to crocodiles as we know them, but one of the key differences lays in their armor. Goniopholids had only 2 pairs of wide, rectangular osteoderms along their back, where modern crocs have 4 pairs. Another curious difference is that their front legs are usually the same size or longer than the rear, which is the opposite for extant crocs. They first appear in the middle of the Triassic and persisted on into the Cretaceous. While we do know that they were around in the early Cretaceous, there has been some speculation that one genus, Denizenosuchus, was a Goniofolid. If that's the case, it would show that these animals persisted into the latter days of the Cretaceous alongside many other members of their family. These animals were moderately sized, not truly giant, but not small either, reaching around 3.5 meters on average, about 12 feet. Goniopholids itself is one of these, and like many crocodiles, they would have been semi-aquatic ambush hunters. They had many of the same adaptations as modern crocs, allowing them to submerge themselves for long periods of time while lying in wait. They would eventually die off in the Cretaceous, however, while some of their cousins continued to thrive. Continuing further down the same line, we get to the stomatosuchids, a very odd family of crocs. Two taxons are here, Stomatosuchus itself and Laganosuchus. Both species appear and disappear within the latter days of the Cretaceous. Stomatosuchids have a very large head with an almost bill-like shape. Their skulls were long and flattened, and in life it may have had a pouch similar to a pelican to hold food or water. Their teeth were small and conical in shape. Combined with their pouch, it suggested a diet that heavily relied on fish or other aquatic prey. Stomatosuchus is also a rather large animal, reaching upwards of 10 meters or 33 feet in length. Despite this size, with their mouth they may have stayed still and simply waited for food to pass into their jaws. Such a large mouth could cover a lot of area, and pressure sensors along their body could help them detect when prey does in fact approach. They were an interesting and unique group of animals. Aside from a few poorly understood Neosuchians such as the Paralligatoridae, which resemble modern crocs even more closely, this brings us to the Eusuchia. This is one of the most important family of crocodilians today, as this is the group that would eventually produce Crocodilia, the family all modern crocodilians fall into. Alongside the Dyrosaurids and the Sebecids, they were one of the only groups to survive the KPG extinction. It possessed three major groups, Allodaposuchidae, the Hyleochampsidae, and the crown group Crocodilia. The most primitive of these, the Hyleochampsids, had shortened snouts and complex teeth for a crocodilian. These teeth are known as multicuspid, similar to our own molars. Combined with their short snout but relatively thick head, this means they were likely herbivores who ate tough and fibrous plant material. Like many of the other herbivorous crocodiliforms, these animals were not very large, with the largest animal thought to reach just over a meter, coming in just shy of 4 feet long. They lived during the Cretaceous, first appearing in the early Cretaceous around 125 million years ago, and they disappear with many of their family in the late Cretaceous. This particular group disappears from the fossil record about 85 million years ago. The next group is known as the Allodaposuchids, with animals like Allodaposuchus itself and Rauisuchids, both of which happen to be from Europe. Allodaposuchus is actually one of the most common crocs in Europe during the late Cretaceous, suggesting that they were a rather successful group. Like many others, their exact placement remains debated. Many consider them to be along the crocodile line, but not true crocodilians themselves, while others have recovered them as some of the most basal true crocodilians. They certainly share a lot of traits with true crocodiles. Aside from a basic body plan, osteoderms, and other common traits, a scan of the brain case of Rauisuchids showed us that they would have had a powerful sense of smell and the ability to pick up on low-frequency sounds. This is something that modern crocs have taken advantage of and suggests that if they are not true crocs, that these traits evolved earlier along the lineage, though where is still unclear. Like the Goniopholids, still don't like that name by the way, they were moderately sized animals, reaching an average of 3 meters, just shy of 10 feet. However, there has been suggested larger sizes for Rauisuchids, but the material is fragmentary and only possesses a skull in completion. These animals are also notable for having rather large legs from what we do have, and were thought to have been able to hunt on land or at least traverse land for longer periods of time than their modern relatives, which is pretty fascinating. And this brings us to a few other taxa just outside of Crocodilia. To transition us into these animals, I brought on a buddy of mine, paleontologist Harrison Duran. Harrison spends a lot of the time in the field, collecting fossils and data, and most of that time is spent in a place known as Hell Creek, one of North America's most famous fossil formations. Hell Creek has been vastly studied, but there's always new and intriguing things we can find, and for that stuff you can always check out Harrison's page. He and his team make incredible content, especially whenever they have a new find, and they always use it as an opportunity to educate folks. I'll make sure to leave a link for their content down below, but for now, go ahead and take us away, Harrison.
Welcome to the Badlands of South Dakota. Within these sand and mudstone formations are my dig sites. And here, scattered amongst some bone, we have the osteoderm of a crocodile. Now this could be from Brachycampsa, Thoracosaurus, or Borealisuchus.
Thank you very much for that, Harrison, and he's confident it belongs to one of those animals because they are the most common crocodilians in Hell Creek. He does have some more crocodile material he's preparing currently, so make sure to check out his page to see even more. But this brings us to the animals themselves. The first of these animals are the Thoracosaurs. Consisting of several genera, the most prominent among these is Thoracosaurus itself, of course. They were a relatively large animal and fairly successful as well in their native environments of Europe and North America. Reaching around 4.5 meters long, about 15 feet, they were once again like large gharials. They had a long and pointed snout, no doubt useful in snatching up fish and other aquatic prey. It has been suggested that Thoracosaurus could have been a semi-marine animal, as it is often found in coastal environments in places like Hell Creek. This would open up their menu significantly, as well as give them other resources to reduce competition with other crocs in their territory. Also residing in Hell's Creek is another animal that isn't a true crocodile but resembles them heavily in Borealisuchus. They were around the same size as Thoracosaurus but had been built in a much different manner. Instead of a long and narrow snout, it had a traditional crocodilian snout that we would come to expect in a sort of triangle shape. These are the closest related animals to the Crocodilia that aren't true crocs themselves. 6 species of Borealisuchus are recognized, and they were one of the survivors of the extinction event. First appearing at the end of the Cretaceous around 70 million years ago, these animals were more successful in the days following and would last into the Eocene around 35 million years ago. The early Borealisuchus species would have had to live in the shadow of the dinosaurs before really getting a chance to dominate afterwards. However, their cousins turned out to be far more successful, and in the end, they too would disappear. These impressive animals likely hunted just like modern crocs, waiting and watching from below the surface of the water. And finally, that brings us to the modern crocodilians and everything that encompasses. But that, folks, is where we're going to end the video this time. Next time, we'll kick off with the true crocodile, so stay tuned because you won't want to miss it. Thank you all for joining me once again. As always, it is very much appreciated, and a double thank you for waiting so very patiently for this video to come out. Make sure to check out part 2 when it's released, and check out my collaborators on this video. Thank you all so very much for watching. Remember to be good people, drink plenty of water, and have a fantastic day.